When we think of crime and violence, we usually imagine adults as the ones responsible. But what if I told you that sometimes the most terrifying criminals are children? Kids who look so innocent you'd never believe they could hurt a fly. Yet behind those sweet faces are minds capable of shockingly brutal acts. What makes them snap? Let's explore some of the most scariest cases where children committed crimes so horrific they left the world in disbelief. Barry Loukaitis, the algebra class nightmare. On a cold February day in 1996, 14-year-old Barry Loukaitis walked into his algebra classroom at Frontier Middle School, Moses Lake, Washington, armed to the teeth, dressed like a gunslinger straight out of an old Western movie. Barry carried a rifle and 2 handguns. What he did next turned the classroom into a scene of chaos and tragedy. Without warning, Barry opened fire, killing 2 14-year-old classmates, Arnold Fritz and Manuel Vela Jr., along with their teacher, Loukaitis. Another student, Natalie Hintz, was gravely injured but miraculously survived the horrific ordeal. Barry's rampage didn't end until a heroic gym teacher, John Lane, burst into the room, disarmed him and held him down until help arrived. Why did Barry do it? He claimed his mood swings drove him to violence, but investigators believed he had meticulously planned the attack, inspired by songs and books. Barry was sentenced to 2 life terms plus 205 years without parole, ensuring he would never harm anyone again. Lionel Tate. Wrestling gone wrong? At just 12 years old, Lionel Tate became one of the youngest murderers in American history. In July 1999, while babysitting 6-year-old Tiffany Eunuch in his Florida home, Lionel claimed he was reenacting professional wrestling moves. What happened next was absolutely horrifying. Tiffany suffered injuries so severe they were more consistent with a brutal attack than playful roughhousing. Her skull was fractured and her liver was lacerated. Lionel was convicted of first-degree murder in 2001 and received a life sentence, making headlines nationwide. However, questions about his mental competency during the trial led to his conviction being overturned in 2004. He was released under house arrest, but soon proved he hadn't learned from his mistakes. In 2006, Lionel was caught trying to rob someone while carrying a gun, landing him back in prison with a 30-year sentence. He remains incarcerated to this day. Alyssa Bustamante. The thrill of killing. Alyssa Bustamante, a 15-year-old from St. Martins, Missouri, committed a shocking crime in 2009. Her victim was 9-year-old Elizabeth Olton, a young girl who trusted Alyssa because she lived nearby. Alyssa lured Elizabeth into the woods where she strangled her, slit her throat, and stabbed her. When asked why she did it, Alyssa said she wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. After the murder, Alyssa buried Elizabeth in a shallow grave and wrote about it in her journal, calling the experience amazing. The case stunned the nation, especially as more details about Alyssa's life emerged. Raised by her grandparents because her parents struggled with addiction and spent time in prison, Alyssa dealt with depression and self-harm. Her online posts often hinted at dark and violent thoughts. Initially charged with first-degree murder, Alyssa later accepted a plea deal for second-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 2024, along with an additional 30 years. Melinda Loveless. A deadly jealousy. Melinda Loveless was just 16 years old when jealousy drove her to commit a terrible crime. The victim was 12-year-old Shanda Scherer, who had become friends with Melinda's ex-girlfriend Amanda Heverin. Melinda, who had a difficult and abusive childhood, became angry and decided to get back at Shanda. On January 10, 1992, Melinda and 3 others convinced Shanda to leave her house late at night. They took her to a remote area where they tortured her. Shanda was stabbed, strangled, and her body was later set on fire. The cruelty of the crime is absolutely unbelievable. Melinda was sentenced to 60 years in prison for her part in the murder. She was released on parole in 2019 after serving 26 years. Her actions and the crime continue to be remembered for their severity. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. The Columbine tragedy. The Columbine High School massacre is one of the darkest chapters in U.S. history. On April 20, 1999, 2 high school seniors, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, turned their rage into a devastating attack. Armed with guns and homemade bombs, they stormed into their school intending to kill as many people as possible. The attack, planned for over a year, began with failed bombs in the school cafeteria. When the explosives didn't detonate, Eric and Dylan entered the building and began shooting indiscriminately. They murdered 12 students and 1 teacher while injuring 24 others. After causing unimaginable pain, they ended their lives in the school library. Eric, often seen as the mastermind, harbored deep hatred and violent tendencies, while Dylan struggled with depression and feelings of isolation. Together, their deadly partnership left a lasting scar on the Columbine community. Ricky Kasso, the Acid King. Ricky Kasso, known as the Acid King, is remembered for a gruesome act of violence that shocked everyone. In the summer of 1984, he invited his friend, Gary Lawers, to a secluded part of the woods for what seemed like a typical drug-fueled gathering. But what started as a night of reckless abandon quickly turned into a violent encounter. Kasso brutally killed Lawers over a dispute involving stolen drugs, claiming afterward that it was done with Satan's approval. What made this case even more chilling was Kasso's attitude. Rather than showing guilt, he boasted about the murder to his friends, almost as if it were an achievement. When police arrested him, the media linked him to the growing fears surrounding youth and satanic influence. His arrest, with an AC/DC shirt, only fueled the panic, as many believed heavy metal music was somehow responsible for violent behavior. Eric M. Smith, a 13-year-old killer. At just 13, Eric M. Smith became infamous for one of the most shocking and tragic crimes committed by a young person in U.S. history. On August 2, 1993, he lured a 4-year-old boy named Derek Roby into a wooded area, pretending to show him a shortcut. Once they were alone, Smith carried out a brutal attack, strangling the boy until he passed out. He then bludgeoned him with a rock and sexually assaulted him with a stick and left him to die. In a horrifying final act, Smith poured Kool-Aid from the child's lunch into his wounds. Smith initially denied the crime but later confessed, detailing the gruesome events to his mother and the police. His chilling confession painted a horrifying picture of the crime. He was tried as an adult, making him the youngest person in New York's history to be convicted as such. At trial, Smith was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 9 years to life in prison. Joshua Phillips, a teen's tragic choice. Joshua Phillips was only 14 years old when he committed a crime that would haunt him forever. On November 3, 1998, he accidentally hit his 8-year-old neighbor, Madeline Ray Clifton, in the eye with a baseball. Fearing how his abusive father would react, Phillips panicked and decided to silence her. To stop her from crying, he hit her with a bat. But when she remained alive, he escalated the violence, stabbing her and cutting her throat. When he realized she was dead, Phillips hid her body under his waterbed and pretended to join the search for her. It wasn't until Phillips' own mother found the body that the truth came out. At his trial in 1999, Phillips was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Over the years, concerns about his mental health arose, and in 2017, he was resentenced. However, he remains in prison to this day. Morgan Geyser, the Slender Man. Stabbing Morgan Geyser was just 12 when she became part of one of the most disturbing cases to emerge from the internet age. On May 31, 2014, Geyser and her friend Anissa Weier lured their classmate Peyton Leutner into the woods in Waukesha, Wisconsin. They had become obsessed with Slender Man, a fictional character from online horror stories. The girls believed that in order to prove their loyalty to him, they had to kill Peyton. In the woods, Geyser stabbed Peyton 19 times, leaving her for dead. Miraculously, Peyton survived and later shared her hope of becoming a doctor despite the trauma. Geyser and Weier were arrested and charged with attempted homicide. They were both found not guilty by reason of mental illness and sent to mental health facilities instead of prison. This case shocked the nation and raised questions about the influence of violent content online. How could two young girls deeply influenced by fictional characters commit such a horrific act? It was a reminder of how easily the lines between reality and fantasy could blur in the minds of impressionable young people. Adam Lanza, the Sandy Hook tragedy. Adam Lanza's name will forever be linked to one of the deadliest school shootings in U.S. history. On December 14, 2012, Lanza carried out a horrific act at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. Before heading to the school, Lanza murdered his own mother. Armed with a Bushmaster rifle, he entered the school and began his violent rampage. Within minutes, 20 children and 6 staff members were killed. What drove Lanza to commit such a terrible act? Diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, Lanza had always struggled with social connections. His behavior became increasingly troubling over time. He spent much of his life isolated and had little support for his growing mental health issues. His mother, a gun enthusiast, had taken him to shooting ranges, fueling his obsession with violence. In the end, Lanza took his own life as police arrived.